Hello, UCAR. Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the CEO's desk. Going to talk about a question I've been getting a lot lately. I've been getting a lot of questions about water. I'll go years without a question about water, but when it rains, it pours. That's a bad dad pun. That's what my kids call it. But a lot of questions about water and how is it handled in the REPC. Now, a quick warning, this is not an in-depth discussion about water law in the state of Utah. Water law is very complicated. And so, we're just going to touch on the topic a little bit. But how does it relate to the REPC and a real estate transaction? Well, years ago, you used to have to list out what water came with the property. It's flipped now. And so 1.4 of the REPC says, water services, the purchase price for the property shall include all water rights / water shares, if any, that are the legal source of seller's current culinary water services and irrigation water service. And then it says that they'll be transferred at closing by applicable instrument, right? And then there's this line that says the following water rights / water shares, if applicable, are specifically excluded from the sale. So if you don't want the water that's servicing that property to go with that property, you as a seller have to exclude the specific water that's coming to that property. So water's kind of weird in Utah. 9 times out of 10, it's the pipe from the city, and it's not that big a deal. But there are properties that are serviced by a well, by a water company that owns shares. So basically, water in Utah is owned by the public. It's collectively owned. And so you have to have permission from the state to use the water, to divert the water and use it. And you can get that directly from the state and have a water right, or you can buy it from a company that owns a bunch of water rights. So an irrigation company, for instance. And those are cities own water rights, and that's how they run their city water. So it's not as easy as, there's a well or a stream on the property, so I get to use the water because it's my water. No, water doesn't work like that in Utah. So what do you do when there are other water rights or shares that are currently being used on the property? Well, the presumption is those will come with the purchase. So if they're not meant to, exclude them in 1.4 of the REPC. If they are meant to, then you got to work out how will these be transferred, because they're all handled slightly differently. So the state, you've got a procedure to go through. An irrigation company, you have their procedure to go through, and you need to handle those and understand how to handle those at settlement. If you don't understand, or if it's complicated and maybe it's a bigger parcel being cut down, what rights and what shares are going where, then there are attorneys that specialize just in water in Utah. It's that complicated. So it might be wise to consult with one of those. All right, so if you have a transaction where it's not just the city water that's being plugged in, it should be covered by 1.4, but there can be confusion at times over the portability of water. If it's currently servicing that property, it should be covered by 1.4. So to alleviate the confusion, it's good to have a discussion and maybe spell out what water is meant to come with this transaction, what the understanding is, and then how that will be transferred at the time of settlement, because that's really when it should all be taken care of and the appropriate documents signed. So just don't let that slip under the radar and surprise you at the end when there's not a good understanding. If you're a listing agent, help the seller understand any water that is servicing this property, it will be covered by this REPC. And if you're a buyer's agent and you see that property needs these water rights, then maybe contact the listing agent and make sure the buyer and seller are on the same page with what is covered by the REPC. So just a tip, it really shouldn't require any additional paperwork as far as the contract goes. It does in the transfer for sure. but it shouldn't in the contract. It should be clear what it covers, but it isn't always. So have that discussion so there are no surprises later, and hopefully you're good to go. Remember, this is not legal advice. This is legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, please contact your attorney. Thanks for tuning in.